As you could probably guess by watching this channel right here and knowing what series it focuses on, I'm a big fan of Pokemon, and this series has led to some of the most memorable games ever. But there's also some Pokemon games I've still yet to have been able to play, and unfortunately, there's some Pokemon games that I'll never be able to play. Today we're going over some games that fit into the former category and some that fit into the latter. Regardless, some are games that never made their way stateside, and others are Pokemon games that have never been released at all. So today we're going over the top 5 cancelled Pokemon games. Number 5. Pokémon TCG GB2. Pokémon TCG 2, known officially as Pokémon Card GB2 Here Comes Team GR, is the sequel to one of my favorite games on the Game Boy Color, Pokémon Trading Card Game, the video game. Surprisingly, the video game based off the card game based off another video game was incredibly solid, and though the AI, as I would later learn, is quite exploitable, it truly did bring the card game to the Game Boy in a way unmatched by any other rival card games of the era. So when I discovered that this game had a sequel that featured an all-new island region, the ability to revisit the island from the first game and refight all the club masters, an expanded card set, its own version of Team Rocket, and an absolutely amazing soundtrack, I was sold. Well, until I realized that this one never left Japan. So what happened? Well, the Game Boy Advance happened, actually. Despite being a fantastic game that sold pretty decently in Japan, Pokémon TCG 2 was released in Japan on the 18th of March 2001, a whole 3 days before the Game Boy Advance over there. With Pokémon Crystal only a few months away in the US alongside the North American GBA launch, and Pokemon games at the time sometimes taking over a year between their Japanese and US releases, Nintendo of America decided to skip over this spin-off and instead focused on working on Pokemon Crystal and the Generation 3 games. The one reason I'm mentioning this here though is because it has an absolutely excellent fan translation, which is absolutely worth your time. Number 4. Pokémon Picross. This is Pokémon Picross by the Jupiter Corporation. This is a Nintendo 3DS spin-off from Generation 6 and is also based off an unreleased title from 1999. What? This is Pokémon Picross, or rather screenshots of it. Based off the crossword-like game of Picross, this spin-off of Generation 1 was aimed to be a partial Game Boy Color port of yet another Picross game by Jupiter that was left in Japan, called Picross NP Volume 1. Never heard of it? That's because that game was not only Japanese exclusive to the Super Nintendo, or rather Super Famicom, but it was only released via the Nintendo Power Service, not to be confused with the US magazine of the same name. The Nintendo Power Service was a flash cartridge that players could buy and then download games onto for a cheap price from various department stores across Japan. While Volume 1 focused on Pokemon, there were 7 other volumes as well, each focusing on games such as Donkey Kong Country and Super Mario 64. However, the Game Boy Color game would just be ports of the puzzles from Volume 1, as it was Pokémon Picross after all. Well, with this Game Boy Color game, what happened? Well, I'm not really sure. Research suggests, however, that likely due to the niche nature of Picross, and also just due to Nintendo being content with the number of Pokemon spin-offs at the time, that Nintendo and Game Freak decided not to translate a game released via Strain's method in Japan's, and Jupiter themselves decided internally to can the GVC version of the game until bringing it back as a freemium downloadable 3DS game 16 years later. Number 3. Poképark Fishing Rally DS. Who remembers DS Download Play? It was a feature of the Nintendo DS that allowed you to download short games and game demos to your DS console for up to 12 hours at a time. And if you went to a Pokemon Center store in Japan between the 10th of May and 25th of September 2005 with your DS, you could download Poképark Fishing Rally DS, which let you go fishing in a river for various water-type Pokemon for up to Generation 3. And really, that was it. Many speculated that this was going to be a part of some sort of Pokemon minigame compilation on the DS or be brought back for the Poképark games on the Wii, but nope, they didn't even bother bringing this one overseas as a demo, meaning that this was merely just a way to get people hyped about Pokemon Japan. Which is a shame, especially since the machine you download the demo from Japan kept track of high scores of everyone who downloaded it, making this fishing minigame have kind of an arcadey charm to it. which is to say it had all the depth of a modern smartphone game. Number 2. Pokémon Stadium and its expansion disc. One of the best known unreleased Pokemon games is Pokémon Stadium. Now, many of you are likely thinking, wait, Pokémon Stadium? I played that as a kid. It let me see all of my favorite Pokemon in 3D and had mini games that are just as fun as your average Mario Party. But what if I told you that the game we got in North America and Europe as Pokémon Stadium was Japan's Pokémon Stadium 2? So what was Pokémon Stadium 1 in Japan? Well, it was this, Pokémon Stadium. Like many Nintendo 64 games, this was originally announced for the ill-fated Nintendo 64 disc drive, and then moved on to a cartridge. However, unlike the game that we got, this one only featured 42 of 151 Pokemon as usable, and it only had 2 tournament modes, both of which were based off the real-life Nintendo Cup tournaments held in Japan in 1997 and 98. It was pretty obvious that this was mostly incomplete upon release, and Game Freak knew it, hence why a year later Japan got the game that we're familiar with. So what about the game that we know as Pokémon Stadium 2? Well, in Japan it's known as Pokémon Stadium Gold and Silver, and it unfortunately does not come in a cool golden N64 cartridge like the one we got over here. However, this was not originally planned as a full release, but rather an expansion for the original Pokémon Stadium, which would be released via the Nintendo 64 disc drive. Nintendo planned expansions like this for several N64 games, however the disc drive would ultimately be delayed until 1999, and would be a massive commercial failure, and would only see 11 releases, with the only one of these expansion discs being the F-Zero X expansion kit, which featured an incredibly in-depth racetrack creation tool. But what does this mean for me as a Pokemon fan? It means that the game I grew up calling Pokémon Stadium is actually Pokémon Stadium 2 in Japan, and that the game we got as Pokémon Stadium 2 isn't even numbered in Japan, and was intended to originally just be the physical equivalent of DLC. Number 1. Pokémon 64 RPG. This one is a cancelled game with the most promise, but also with the least info available. This game was also planned for the ill-fated Nintendo 64 DD disc drive, and would you believe it that it was going to be a full-blown home console Pokemon RPG? 20 years before Pokemon Let's Go and 6 before Pokemon Colosseum, a full-blown Pokemon adventure was in the works for Nintendo 64. We don't know if it was going to be a new adventure or an updated version of Red and Blue version. We don't even know if it ever got past the concept phase. What we do know is that it was in the works, and that if it weren't for the 64 disc drive being announced before the release of the Nintendo 64 itself, then being constantly pushed back for years before being released via mail order only in Japan exclusively, and then being the worst selling piece of Nintendo hardware ever, and I mean literally ever, then we may have had a fully playable 3D Pokemon adventure on the Nintendo 64, along with also potentially the N64 version of Mother 3. So with that, that's it for our video on 5 cancelled Pokemon games. What Pokemon topics do you want to see covered in future videos? Let me know in the comment section below, and while you're at it, subscribe to Master Trainer to keep updated on anything and everything Pokemon. With that, I'll see you next time.